Finding growth factor from a table. What is growth factor? For a table, the growth factor is the multiplicative pattern as we move down. In this example, notice that as we move down each row, we're multiplying each term by times 3. 4 times 3 is 12, 12 times 3 is 36, and 36 times 3 is 108. So for this table, the growth factor would be 3. Problem 1. What's the growth factor for this table? Or in other words, what do we have to multiply in order to move down each row? Notice to get from 2 to 4, we have to multiply by times 2. From 4 to 8, that's another times 2. And from 8 to 16, that's times 2. Since we're multiplying by 2 repeatedly, our growth factor is going to be 2. Problem 2. What's the growth factor for this table? Notice that as I move down each row, each term is getting smaller. 27 is smaller than 81, 9 is smaller than 27. Since it's getting smaller, we know that our growth factor has to be multiplying by a decimal or a fraction. For this table here, notice that our growth factor is going to be multiplying by a third. A third of 81 is 27. A third of 27 is 9. And a third of 9 is 3. So our growth factor is 1/3. Problem 3. What's the growth factor for this table? Notice that as we're moving down, each term is getting cut in half. The growth factor for this table is going to be a half, or 0.5. Half of 64 is going to be 32. Half of 32 is going to be 16. And half of 16 is going to be 8. So the growth factor is going to be 0.5. Problem 4. What's the growth factor for this table? This problem is a little bit more complicated than the others because our growth factor is not going to be a whole number. In order to figure out what the growth factor is, I can answer the following question. What mystery number can I multiply the 4 that will bring it to the next row, 6? 4 times what growth factor will turn it into 6? How can I rewrite this expression to determine the growth factor? I could rewrite this as, if I divided both sides by 4, the 4 would cancel out, leaving me with just the growth factor, and the other side will get 6 divided by 4. So dividing both sides by 4, we get 6 divided by 4. And I can see that our growth factor is going to be 1.5 because 6 divided by 4 is 1.5. So I know my growth factor is times 1.5. 4 times 1.5 is 6. 6 times 1.5 is 9. And 9 times 1.5 is 13.5. So our growth factor isn't always going to be a whole number. We could always take the next term divided by the term before it to help us figure out what the growth factor is. Problem 5. What's the growth factor for this table? Notice that as I move down, 8 times 4 is going to bring us to 32. 32 times 4 is going to be 128. And 128 times 4 is going to be 512. So our growth factor is times 4. Now, how can I use the growth factor to go backwards and figure out what our initial value is? If our pattern was addition, we know that to go backwards, we have to subtract to move up the table. Here we're multiplying as we move down each row. What would be the opposite of multiplication? How would we move back up each row? It turns out to move backwards, the opposite of multiplication is to divide. We can divide by 4 to move back up. 128 divided by 4 is 32. 32 divided by 4 is going to be 8. So to figure out my initial value, I can take 8 and divide it by 4. And that will bring me up to an initial value of 2. So moving down, we can multiply. And going backwards, we can divide. Another option for moving backwards is using the reciprocal. So we know that our growth factor is going to be 4, which can be written as 4 over 1. So moving backwards, the reciprocal for this one is, I would flip the numerator and the denominator. I'll get the reciprocal of 1 over 4. So another way of moving up would be multiplying by 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4. Because multiplying by the reciprocal or dividing by 4 turns out to be the same amount. We know that dividing by 4 gives us 0.25 and 1/4 is 0.25. To summarize, the growth factor is going to be the multiplicative pattern as we move down the table. One shortcut for helping us figure out the growth factor is by taking the next term and dividing it by the previous term.